1999, British intelligence finally caught their most valuable Soviet spy. She was 87 years old, but she wasn't running, she wasn't hiding, she was pruning her rose bushes, and she was completely unsurprised to see them. Her name was Melita Norwood. She wasn't a physicist. She wasn't a military officer or a diplomat or a man in a trench coat. She was a secretary at a technical research body so unglamorous it has never once appeared in any spy novel. And in 1999, when British intelligence finally came to her door, she was 87 years old, wearing a beige cardigan, holding a pair of pruning shears, and on the garden wall behind her sat a mug printed with the face of Che Guevara. In a few minutes, she would walk to the end of her driveway, read a prepared statement to the assembled press of the United Kingdom, confirm that, yes, for nearly 4 decades, she had passed classified British nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union, and then go back inside and make a cup of tea. She did not apologize, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how a secretary from Southeast London became the Soviet Union's most valuable asset in the West, you have to go back to a kitchen table, back to a handbag, back to London in 1937 when the world was tilting toward catastrophe, and one 25-year-old woman decided she knew exactly which side she was on. Picture London in 1937. You're standing in a city that has been watching Europe for a decade and doesn't like what it sees. The Spanish Civil War is 7 months old. Hitler has remilitarized the Rhineland without consequence. Mussolini and Franco are exchanging telegrams about the future shape of the continent. In London drawing rooms, in trade union halls, in the common rooms of Oxford and Cambridge, the argument is always the same. What do you do when the worst thing you can imagine is actually happening, and the people who are supposed to stop it keep deciding not to? For a certain generation of young Britons, there is only one answer. Melita Norwood is 25 years old. Her father, Alexander Cernis, was a Latvian political activist who brought his family to England and spent his spare time distributing socialist literature in Bournemouth. Her mother ran a small, radical newspaper out of their home. Melita grew up at a kitchen table where the dinner conversation was about the class struggle, and she absorbed it the way most children absorb religion, completely, unquestioningly, as the background frequency of the world. She is not naive. She is a true believer. There's a difference. She works as a secretary at the British Non-Ferrous Metals Research Association, the BNFMRA, a technical research body so spectacularly unglamorous that it has never once appeared in any spy novel. It processes data on copper alloys and tin production and the metallurgical properties of industrial materials. No one who is anyone works there, which is, of course, exactly why it matters. Everything about the BNFMRA was designed to make it invisible to threats. The problem is that worked both ways. In 1937, a Soviet handler makes contact. The NKVD, Stalin's intelligence service, predecessor to the KGB, has been running an aggressive recruitment operation in Britain for years. They are looking for specific things: access, patience, an ideological conviction deep enough to survive the long, cold stretches between moments of usefulness. Melita Norwood has all three. She is given a code name. They call her Agent Hola. For the next 4 years, nothing dramatic happens. She files documents, she answers correspondence, she is, by every measure, the kind of employee who receives a thank you card at Christmas and is briefly mentioned at leaving parties. But here's where the story stops being about ideology and starts being about physics. In the summer of 1941, a report lands on Winston Churchill's desk. It's called the Maud Report, written by a committee of British physicists, and it concludes that an atomic bomb is not only theoretically possible, but practically achievable within 2 to 3 years. And Churchill reads it and funds it. Britain's atomic program gets a cover name, Tube Alloys, and a home. Much of the administrative and materials research work flows through the BNFMRA, which means it flows across Melita Norwood's desk. Think about what she's looking at. Not vague policy documents, not strategic memos about intent. She is handling the actual metallurgical specifications, the uranium and alloy compositions, the chemical separation processes, the materials science that sits at the base of the entire weapons program, like the foundations of a building. She doesn't need to understand nuclear physics to understand that what she's holding is consequential. She makes a decision. Her method would disappoint anyone expecting tradecraft from a spy novel. There is no elaborate system of dead drops, no invisible ink, no clandestine meetings in Turkish baths. What she develops isn't tradecraft. It's something simpler and more dangerous. Call it kitchen table intelligence. She takes the files home in her handbag. She spreads them on the kitchen table. She photographs them, one page at a time, consistent exposure, making sure the corners are flat. She puts them back in her bag. She returns them to the office the next morning, filed correctly in the right order. Her husband, Hillary, a committed communist, a man who argued Marxist theory at dinner parties and gave money to the Communist Party of Great Britain, sits in the other room while she does it. He argues Marxist theory at dinner parties. She actually lives it. He has no idea. She makes sure the tea is ready before he wakes up. Now hold that image. You are in a city being bombed. The Luftwaffe has been hitting London since September 1940, 57 consecutive nights at the start, then intermittently, unpredictably, which is somehow worse. Every night there are fires visible from the roof of your building, and somewhere in your bag, or tucked between the pages of a novel, or wrapped in a handkerchief in your coat pocket, there is microfilm. Not love letters, not diary pages, uranium enrichment specifications, and alloy processing data for Britain's secret atomic weapons program. If someone finds it, a warden, a police constable, an ARP officer doing a random check in a shelter, you are not going to prison. You are going to be shot. She carries it anyway. She does this intermittently for years. What she actually passes is not symbolic. It is structural. Soviet physicists working on their own bomb program, led by Igor Kurchatov, are working largely in the dark. Western estimates hold that the Soviets are 10 years behind, minimum, that they don't have the industrial base, the technical precision, the materials knowledge to close the gap. What Agent Hola sends them allows Kurchatov's team to eliminate years of experimental dead ends, the specific alloy compositions, the chemical processes for separating fissile material, data that would have taken the scientists years of trial and error to replicate, handed over, neat and complete from a kitchen table in southeast London. On August 29, 1949, 4 years ahead of the most optimistic Western intelligence estimate, the Soviet Union detonates its first nuclear device. They call it First Lightning. The world changes. The arms race that defines the next 40 years begins. The tea is already made. She got away with it for 30 years, and what she did next is somehow the strangest part of the entire story. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Hit subscribe, because the story we're covering next, we hope will keep you coming back for more. And here's the thing you're probably thinking right now. How does someone do all of that and then just disappear back into normal life? The answer is more unsettling than you'd expect. Decades pass, the world Melita Norwood helped build hardens into its permanent shape. The Berlin Wall goes up. The Cuban Missile Crisis comes and goes. 13 days of nuclear brinkmanship that the two superpowers survive mostly by luck. The arms race she accelerated produces enough warheads to destroy human civilization, approximately 30 times over. She retires from the BNFMRA in 1972. She is 60 years old. She collects her pension. She plants things. The Soviet Union, at some point in the intervening years, sends her a formal recognition, the Order of the Red Banner, one of the USSR's highest civilian honors. It arrives quietly. There is no ceremony. There cannot be. She keeps it in a drawer. She joins the campaign for nuclear disarmament, Britain's anti-nuclear protest movement, and attends rallies against the very weapons she helped build. She volunteers. She sits in rooms with people who have no idea they are in the presence of the woman who made all of it possible. She has, by every available evidence, made her peace with what she did, not suppressed it, made peace with it. The distinction matters. There is no indication in anything she ever said or wrote that she lost sleep over any of it. In 1992, a former KGB archivist named Vasily Mitrokhin defects to British intelligence. Mitrokhin spent 30 years in the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, working in the archives section, the room where operational files go to be stored, cataloged, and occasionally forgotten. He was not a field agent. He did not recruit assets or run operations. He read files, he indexed them, and for 12 years, beginning in the late 1970s, he did something extraordinary. He copied them by hand on scraps of paper, which he smuggled home in his shoes. He hid his notes in tin canisters buried under the floor of his dacha outside Moscow. Milk churns, shoe boxes, whatever he had. When the Soviet Union collapsed and he saw his opportunity, he dug them up and brought them out. 6 trunks of transcribed intelligence, going back to the 1930s.
British intelligence services spend years working through the material. The operation is careful, slow, systematic. Code names get matched to real individuals. Operational details get cross-referenced with employment records and known Communist Party affiliations, and employee roles from organizations that no longer exist.
The code name Hola surfaces: female, long-term access, materials research, British Atomic Program. The list of women who work at the BNFMRA during the relevant period is not long. They cross-reference against known communist sympathizers, against women with the right access, the right ideological background, the right years of service. The list gets shorter and shorter. The code name Hola surfaces, and suddenly, the most embarrassing question in British intelligence history has an answer nobody wanted. It ends at a woman who is, at this moment, 85 years old, and who is very likely in her garden. You spent years doing this. You sat across from people who confessed because they were scared, and people who confessed because they were relieved, and people who spent the first 3 hours denying everything before something in them gave way. You've learned to read the room. The door opens. She looks at you. She is 87. She is wearing a cardigan. She has, based on the state of her hands, just come in from the garden. She is not afraid. There is no dramatic moment. She does not crumble. She does not reach for the telephone or ask for a solicitor or do any of the things that training tells you people do when the thing they have been dreading for 40 years finally arrives. Because she hasn't been dreading it. That's the thing you realize standing in her doorway. She simply decided a very long time ago that she was right, and she never changed her mind. She confirms the material facts. She doesn't dispute them. The government's response, when it comes, is not prosecution. It is something closer to institutional embarrassment, dressed up as procedural caution. The Crown Prosecution Service reviews the case and determines correctly that a trial would be complicated, expensive, historically awkward, and would require ventilating atomic secrets that Whitehall would rather keep buried. She is elderly. The crimes are 50 years old. The victims are, in a meaningful sense, a world order that no longer exists. They decline to charge her. What she says, standing in her driveway in Bexley Heath with the press of the nation in front of her, is this: I did not want money. I felt the Soviet Union needed help. I wanted Russia to be on a par with the West. She folds her statement. She answers 2 questions. She goes back inside. The newspapers spend the next week trying to decide how to feel about her. She doesn't help them. She doesn't give additional interviews. She doesn't write a memoir. She doesn't appear on television to explain herself, or apologize, or perform regret for an audience that wants her to be either a villain or a hero. She goes back to her garden. She lives to be 93 years old. She dies in June 2005 in the same house, on the same street, never having moved. She does not express regret, not in any interview, not in any letter, not in anything that survives her. There are people who spent their lives in the intelligence services, people who dedicated careers to hunting exactly her kind of agent, who find this infuriating to the point of speechlessness. And there are others who look at a 25-year-old woman in 1937 watching Europe slide toward fascism, making the best decision she can with what she knows, and find the moral arithmetic considerably more difficult. The lesson MI5 took from Melita Norwood is one that intelligence services still haven't fully solved. We build our security systems around the threats that are visible to us. the brilliant scientist, the ambitious military man, the diplomat with expensive tastes. We build profiles, we build watch lists, we look for people who look like spies. But Melita Norwood didn't look like a spy. She looked like a secretary. She was not recruited from an elite university. She was not the product of a sophisticated intelligence operation targeting brilliant young minds. She used no technology beyond a small camera and a handbag. She passed secrets for the better part of a decade and then stopped quietly and lived a further 30 years in the same house, tending the same garden. And the people looking for her didn't find her until she was nearly 90. And when they did, she was in the garden. What makes her the most dangerous kind of operative isn't what she did, it's what she wasn't. She wasn't exceptional. She wasn't glamorous. She wasn't visible. She filed the papers. She made the tea. She was beneath consideration. She was nobody. She was the one who changed the world.